March 23rd, 1945. The small village of Remagen sat frozen under a blanket of late winter snow, its cobblestone streets echoing with the distant rumble of Allied armor advancing toward the Rhine River. In a modest house on Kirchgasse Street, 42-year-old Greta Müller clutched her 3 children closer as the sounds of the approaching conflict grew louder. She had been told by the retreating German forces that the enemy soldiers were monsters, particularly the dark-skinned ones from America, who would show no mercy to German civilians. How utterly wrong those warnings would prove to be, and how completely they would transform not just one woman's understanding, but challenge everything she had been taught to believe about race, humanity, and the true nature of compassion in the darkest of times. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable true account of how a chance encounter between a starving German family and a unit of African-American soldiers would shatter decades of propaganda and reveal the profound power of human kindness to transcend the artificial barriers that divide us. Greta Müller had spent the last 6 months watching her world crumble piece by piece. Her husband Klaus had been conscripted into the German armed forces during the war in 1943 and had not returned from the Eastern Front. No official word had come, but the silence spoke volumes in a village where bad news traveled faster than good. She had been left alone to care for their 3 children, 12-year-old Hans, 8-year-old Liesel, and 4-year-old Wilhelm. The winter of 1944 to 1945 had been particularly harsh, not just in terms of weather, but in the complete breakdown of supply lines that had once sustained even small communities like Remagen. The local ration system had collapsed by February, leaving families to survive on whatever they could forage, trade, or preserve from better times. Greta's small vegetable garden, which had sustained them through the previous summer, lay buried under 2 feet of snow with no prospect of planting for months to come. The children had grown thin, their cheeks hollow and eyes too large for their faces. Hans, who should have been helping with the younger ones, spent most of his energy just staying warm. Liesel had stopped asking for second helpings at dinner because she understood there were none to give. Little Wilhelm, who had once been a chubby, energetic toddler, now moved with the careful deliberation of someone much older, as if he instinctively knew that every calorie had to be conserved. By mid-March, Greta estimated they had perhaps a week's worth of food remaining, some dried beans, a small portion of preserved sausage that Klaus had prepared before his departure, and 3 precious jars of pickled cabbage that she had been saving for the most desperate of times. That time had clearly arrived. The propaganda that had filled German radio broadcasts and newspapers throughout the conflict had painted a particularly frightening picture of African-American soldiers. They were described as savage, undisciplined troops who had been deliberately deployed by the Allies to terrorize German civilians. The local authorities had warned that these soldiers, coming from what they called primitive backgrounds, would show no understanding of European civilization or Christian values. Greta, like most of her neighbors, had accepted these characterizations without question. She had never met anyone of African descent in her entire life, and her understanding of the wider world was limited to what official sources told her. The idea that soldiers of any background could be compassionate seemed impossible when every day brought news of the conflict's approach and the destruction it would surely bring. On the morning of March 23rd, the sounds that had been distant for days suddenly became immediate and overwhelming. The rumble of tank treads on cobblestones, the shouting of orders in English, and the general commotion of a military unit establishing control over a newly captured area filled the air outside the Müller house. Greta gathered her children in the small kitchen at the back of the house, the room furthest from the street, and the one that offered the most potential hiding places should the need arise. She had prepared a space in the root cellar where they could hide if necessary, though she worried that the dampness and cold would be worse for the children than whatever they might face above ground. Through the small window that faced the back garden, she could see soldiers moving through the area, checking each building systematically. They wore the distinctive uniforms of American forces, and even from a distance, she could see that many of them were the African-American troops she had been warned about. Her heart raced as she tried to decide what to do. The children sensed her fear and huddled closer, Wilhelm climbing into her lap, while Hans positioned himself protectively near his younger sister. The approaching footsteps on the street grew louder, accompanied by voices speaking English in what sounded like organized professional communication, rather than the chaotic shouting she had expected. When the knock came at the front door, it was firm but not violent. 3 measured raps followed by a voice calling out in heavily accented German, "Residents, please open the door. We are American forces. We mean no harm to civilians." Greta's hands trembled as she considered her options. She could ignore the request and hope they would move on. But the systematic way they seemed to be checking each house suggested that would only delay the inevitable. She could try to hide in the cellar with the children, but the risk of being discovered seemed worse than facing whatever was about to happen directly. Taking a deep breath, she told the children to stay in the kitchen and made her way to the front door. Her hand hesitated on the lock for a moment before she slowly opened it, prepared for the worst. Standing on her doorstep were 3 American soldiers in winter combat gear. The one who had knocked was a tall African-American man with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and kind eyes that seemed completely at odds with everything she had been told to expect. Behind him stood 2 other soldiers, also African-American, both watching the surrounding area with professional alertness, but showing no signs of aggression toward her. The sergeant removed his helmet as he spoke, revealing close-cropped hair and a face that showed concern rather than hostility. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant James Washington with the United States Army. We're conducting a security sweep of the area. Are you alone here?" Greta found herself staring, not out of rudeness but out of complete surprise. The man speaking to her was nothing like what she had expected. His German was limited but clearly practiced, suggesting he had made an effort to learn enough to communicate with civilians. His manner was respectful, almost gentle, and his concern seemed genuine. I have my children with me," she managed to say in her limited English, surprised by her own willingness to respond honestly. "How many children, ma'am?" Sergeant Washington asked, switching back to his careful German. "Are they healthy? Do you have enough food?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. This was not the interrogation she had feared, but rather what sounded like genuine concern for her family's welfare. She found herself answering before she could think better of it. "3 children," she said quietly. "We have very little food left. It has been a difficult winter." The sergeant exchanged glances with his companions, and she caught fragments of their English conversation. Words like kids, hungry, and supplies were mixed with others she couldn't understand, but the tone was clearly one of concern rather than threat. "Ma'am, would it be possible for us to see the children?" Sergeant Washington asked. "We have medical supplies if anyone needs attention, and we might be able to help with food as well." Greta hesitated. Everything she had been taught told her that allowing enemy soldiers into her home was dangerous. Particularly these soldiers she had been warned were the most dangerous of all. But the evidence of her own eyes and ears contradicted everything she had been told. These men seemed genuinely concerned about her family's welfare. The moment of decision came when she heard Wilhelm crying in the kitchen, a thin, weak sound that she knew meant he was truly hungry rather than just seeking attention. The sound seemed to affect the soldiers as well, particularly Sergeant Washington, whose expression grew more serious. "Please," he said quietly, "let us help if we can." Against every instinct that had been drilled into her by months of propaganda, Greta stepped aside and allowed the 3 soldiers to enter her home. As they followed her toward the kitchen, she was struck by how carefully they moved, removing their boots without being asked, and making an obvious effort not to track mud or snow through her house. When they entered the kitchen and saw the 3 children huddled together, the transformation in the soldiers was immediate and profound. All military bearing seemed to fall away, replaced by what could only be described as paternal concern. The children stared with wide eyes, clearly frightened, but also curious about these unexpected visitors. Sergeant Washington knelt down to bring himself to the children's eye level, moving slowly and keeping his hands visible. "Hello," he said in German, followed by what Greta realized was probably the same greeting in English for good measure. Hans, as the oldest, found his voice first. "Are you going to hurt us?" he asked in careful English that Greta didn't know he had learned. The sergeant's response was immediate and emphatic. "No, son, we're here to help. What are your names?" As the introductions proceeded, the other two soldiers had been quietly assessing the situation. Corporal David Thompson, a medic from Detroit, was already opening his field medical kit to examine the children for signs of malnutrition or illness. Private First Class Robert Jackson from New Orleans was looking through the nearly empty pantry and refrigerator with obvious concern. "Sergeant," Corporal Thompson said quietly in English, "these kids are malnourished. Not critically, but they need food soon, and the little one especially needs protein and vitamins." Private Jackson's assessment was equally grim. "They've got maybe 2 days of food left, and that's if they stretch it." Sergeant Washington nodded grimly, then turned back to Greta. "Ma'am, with your permission, we'd like to bring some supplies from our unit. Food, medical supplies, anything your family needs." Greta found herself in completely unfamiliar territory. Not only were these soldiers not the monsters she had been led to expect, they were offering to help her family survive. The contradiction between reality and everything she had been taught was so stark that she struggled to process it. "Why would you help us?" she asked, the question coming out in German before she could think to translate it. Sergeant Washington seemed to understand the sentiment, if not the exact words. "Because you have children," he said simply. "Because they're hungry. Because it's the right thing to do." The simplicity of his answer, delivered without any apparent political motivation or agenda, struck her more powerfully than any complex explanation could have. Here was a man who saw hungry children and wanted to help them, regardless of nationality, race, or the circumstances that had brought them together. Over the next hour, the small house on Kirchgasser Street became the center of an operation that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Sergeant Washington sent Private Jackson back to their unit's temporary base to request food supplies, while Corporal Thompson conducted a thorough but gentle examination of all 3 children. His findings were concerning, but not hopeless. All 3 children showed signs of prolonged inadequate nutrition, with Wilhelm being the most affected due to his age and higher caloric needs. Hans had developed a persistent cough that might have been due to weakened immunity, while Liesel showed signs of vitamin deficiency that could lead to serious problems if not addressed soon. The good news, Corporal Thompson explained to Greta in his careful German, is that none of this is irreversible. With proper nutrition and some basic medical care, all 3 children should recover completely. While they waited for Private Jackson to return with supplies, Sergeant Washington found himself in conversation with Hans, whose English proved to be quite good for a 12-year-old. The boy had learned it in school before the conflict disrupted education, and he was curious about these soldiers, who seemed so different from what he had been told to expect. "My father said American soldiers were all rich and soft," Hans said with the directness that only children can manage, "but you don't seem soft." Sergeant Washington smiled at the observation. "Well, I grew up poor in Alabama, so I'm definitely not rich, and I suppose whether I'm soft or not depends on what you mean. I try to be kind to people who need help. Does that make me soft?" Hans considered this seriously. "I think it makes you good," he decided. The conversation was interrupted by Private Jackson's return, but he didn't come alone. Behind him came 3 more soldiers carrying boxes and bags that seemed impossibly abundant to a family that had been living on the edge of starvation. The supplies they brought represented more food than the Muller family had seen in months. Canned meat, dried fruits, powdered milk, crackers, chocolate bars that made the children's eyes widen with delight, and medical supplies that Corporal Thompson immediately put to use. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that amazed Greta. It was the careful thought that had gone into the selection. Someone had clearly considered what would be most nutritious for children, what could be prepared easily with limited cooking facilities, and what would store well in the cool temperatures of the house. "This is from our unit's emergency supplies," Sergeant Washington explained. "We always carry extra for situations like this." "Situations like this?" Greta asked. "Hungry families," he said simply. "We've liberated a lot of towns, and there are always families who need help. It's part of what we do." As the soldiers organized the supplies, and Corporal Thompson prepared appropriate portions for the children to begin eating, Greta found herself observing details that challenged everything she thought she understood about these men. She noticed how Sergeant Washington automatically helped organize the food in her pantry in a way that would make it easy for her to find what she needed. She saw how Corporal Thompson took time to explain to Hans what vitamins were and why they were important for growing strong. She watched Private Jackson show Liesel and Wilhelm how to properly unwrap the chocolate bars to make them last longer. These were not the actions of savage conquerors or undisciplined troops. These were the careful, considerate actions of men who understood family life, who had probably been children themselves not so long ago, and who recognized the universal nature of a parent's love for their children. As the afternoon progressed, more soldiers from their unit stopped by to check on the situation. Each one greeted the children warmly, and many brought additional small items: a toy soldier for Wilhelm, colored pencils for Liesel, a book in English for Hans to practice his language skills. The transformation in her children was remarkable and immediate. Color began to return to their cheeks as they ate their first substantial meal in weeks. More importantly, the fear and tension that had characterized their behavior for months began to fade, replaced by curiosity and even laughter as the soldiers taught them simple games and English phrases. By evening, when the soldiers prepared to leave for the night, the scene in the Müller house was completely different from what it had been that morning. The children were playing a card game that Private Jackson had taught them, arguing good-naturedly about the rules in a mixture of German and English. The pantry was stocked with enough food to last at least 2 weeks, and Corporal Thompson had left enough medical supplies to address the children's nutritional deficiencies. But the most profound change was in Greta herself. The fear and suspicion that had dominated her thoughts for months had been replaced by a confusion that was somehow more comfortable than the certainty she had felt before. Everything she had been told about these soldiers had proved to be not just wrong, but almost impossibly wrong. As Sergeant Washington prepared to leave, he turned to her with obvious concern. "Ma'am, I need to be honest with you. We'll be moving through this area for several more days, but then our unit will be reassigned elsewhere. I want to make sure your family will be all right after we're gone." The thoughtfulness of his concern struck her deeply. Here was a man who was fighting a conflict, who had countless military responsibilities, taking time to worry about the long-term welfare of an enemy civilian family. "The war is nearly over," she said quietly, using some of the English words Hans had taught her that afternoon. "Perhaps things will be better then." "I hope so," he replied. "You and your children deserve better than this." That night, as Greta lay in bed listening to her children sleep more peacefully than they had in months, she found herself reviewing everything that had happened. The contrast between what she had expected and what had actually occurred was so stark that it forced her to question not just her assumptions about these particular soldiers, but about everything she had been taught regarding race, nationality, and human nature itself. She had been raised in a small homogeneous community where differences of any kind were rare and often viewed with suspicion. The propaganda of recent years had built upon those existing prejudices, creating elaborate theories about racial hierarchies and cultural superiority that had seemed logical when she had no contradictory evidence to challenge them. But now she had spent an entire day watching African-American soldiers demonstrate kindness, intelligence, discipline, and genuine concern for her family's welfare. Their actions had been motivated not by any political agenda or military necessity, but by simple human compassion. They had seen hungry children and had responded with food. They had seen a struggling family and had offered help. The simplicity of their motivation was perhaps the most challenging aspect of the entire experience. These men hadn't helped her family to prove a point or to win hearts and minds or to demonstrate their moral superiority. They had helped because helping was the natural response to need, and they were the kind of people for whom such responses came naturally. Over the following days, as Sergeant Washington's unit continued their operations in the area, the relationship between the soldiers and the Müller family deepened and evolved. What had begun as emergency assistance grew into something resembling friendship, despite the barriers of language, culture, and the circumstances that had brought them together. Hans, whose facility with English made him something of a translator for his siblings, became particularly attached to Sergeant Washington. The boy was fascinated by the sergeant's stories of growing up in Alabama, a place that seemed impossibly exotic to a child who had never traveled more than 50 kilometers from his birthplace. "Is it true that in America there are cities with buildings taller than our church?" Hans asked one afternoon as they shared a meal that combined American military rations with vegetables from Greta's preserved supplies. "Much taller," Sergeant Washington replied. "In New York City there are buildings with over 100 floors, so tall that clouds sometimes pass between the floors." The children listened to such descriptions with the same wonder that children everywhere reserve for tales of far-off places and impossible things. But Greta found herself equally fascinated, not just by the descriptions of American cities, but by the matter-of-fact way Sergeant Washington described a world where people of all backgrounds lived and worked together. "In my unit," he explained to Hans, who translated for his siblings, "we have men from many different backgrounds, some from farms, some from cities, some whose families came from Ireland, some from Italy, some from Germany, some from Africa. We all wear the same uniform, follow the same orders, look out for each other." This description of diversity and cooperation was so foreign to Greta's experience that she initially had trouble believing it could be true. But the evidence was right in front of her, in the form of soldiers from different backgrounds working together with obvious mutual respect and shared purpose. On the fourth day of their stay in Remagen, an incident occurred that would prove to be the final piece in Greta's transformation of understanding. A group of German civilians from a neighboring village approached the American position, desperate for food and medical attention for several elderly residents who were seriously ill. Greta watched from her window as Sergeant Washington and his men responded to this request. There was no hesitation, no debate about whether these people deserved help or whether assisting them served any military purpose. The soldiers immediately organized a relief effort, sharing their own supplies and arranging for Corporal Thompson to provide medical care to those who needed it. What struck Greta most powerfully was the complete absence of any sense of superiority or condescension in how the soldiers treated these desperate German civilians. They didn't lecture them about ideology or make them feel ashamed for asking for help. They simply provided what assistance they could and treated everyone with dignity and respect. That evening, as she helped prepare a large meal that would feed both the soldiers and several of the German civilians who had been invited to stay for dinner, Greta found herself working alongside men she had been taught to consider her racial and cultural inferiors. The absurdity of such categorizations became more obvious with each passing moment. Corporal Thompson, who had grown up in Detroit and whose grandmother had immigrated from Poland, shared stories about his family's traditional recipes with Greta's neighbor, Frau Weber, whose husband had worked in a factory not unlike the one where Thompson's father was employed. Private Jackson, whose knowledge of food preservation came from growing up on a farm in Louisiana, gave valuable advice to Herr Schmidt about how to make the most of limited garden space. These were not interactions between representatives of different races or nations, but simply people sharing common experiences and knowledge. The artificial categories that had seemed so important just days earlier revealed themselves to be meaningless in the face of shared humanity. The meal itself became a symbol of this emerging understanding. German preserves and vegetables combined with American rations and African-American family recipes to create something that belonged to no single culture but drew strength from multiple traditions. The children, who had initially been frightened of these strange soldiers, were now teaching them German words while learning English phrases in return. As the evening wound down and the soldiers prepared to return to their temporary quarters, Sergeant Washington approached Greta with obvious reluctance to bring up a difficult subject. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "I need to let you know that we've received orders to move out tomorrow morning. Our unit is being reassigned to support operations further east." The news hit Greta harder than she had expected. Over the course of less than a week, these soldiers had become not just providers of essential assistance, but genuine friends. The thought of returning to the isolation and uncertainty that had characterized her life before their arrival was almost overwhelming. "Will we see you again?" Hans asked, his English now confident enough to express complex emotions. "I don't know, son," Sergeant Washington replied honestly. The conflict is moving pretty quickly now, and we go where we're needed. That night, Greta found herself unable to sleep, not because of worry or fear as had been the case for so many months, but because she was trying to process the magnitude of the change that had occurred in her understanding of the world. A week earlier, she had been a woman whose worldview was built on clear categories: us and them, German and foreign, white and black, civilized and savage. These categories had provided a kind of comfort, even in their harshness, because they made the world seem predictable and understandable. But now those categories lay in ruins, destroyed not by argument or persuasion, but by simple exposure to reality. She had seen kindness where she expected cruelty, intelligence where she expected ignorance, discipline where she expected chaos, and humanity where she expected something less than human. The most profound realization was that the change hadn't been in the soldiers themselves, who were undoubtedly the same men they had always been. The change had been in her own ability to see them clearly, freed from the distorting lens of prejudice and propaganda. When morning came and the soldiers prepared to leave Remagen, the farewell scene was emotional in ways that would have been unimaginable just a week earlier. Hans hugged Sergeant Washington tightly, while Liesel presented him with a drawing she had made of the soldiers sharing a meal with her family. Wilhelm, too young to fully understand what was happening, nevertheless sensed the sadness of the adults and clung to Corporal Thompson's leg. But it was Greta's farewell to Sergeant Washington that carried the most weight. As the man who had knocked on her door that first day prepared to leave, she found herself struggling to find words adequate to express what his kindness had meant to her family. "Sergeant Washington," she said in her careful English, "before you came, I thought. I believed." She paused, searching for the right words to express something she had never had to articulate before. "I believed you were different. Bad different. I was wrong. Very wrong." He nodded with understanding that suggested he had encountered such misconceptions before. "Ma'am, I hope someday the world will be a place where people don't have to learn about each other the hard way. You saved my children," she continued, tears making her voice unsteady. "But you also saved me, from thinking bad things, from being afraid of good people." As the soldiers marched away down Kirchgasse Street, heading toward whatever assignment awaited them in a conflict that was indeed nearing its end, Greta stood in her doorway with her children and watched until they disappeared around the corner. The supplies they had left behind would sustain the Muller family for weeks to come, but the change they had brought to Greta's understanding would last a lifetime. She had learned that kindness knows no color, that intelligence is not the property of any single race, and that the capacity for goodness exists in all people, regardless of the artificial categories that societies create to divide them. In the months that followed, as the conflict in Europe came to its conclusion, and Germany began the long process of rebuilding both its infrastructure and its moral foundation, Greta found herself in the unique position of being able to speak from personal experience about the falsehood of racial prejudice. When neighbors expressed suspicion about the African American soldiers who continued to serve in occupation forces throughout Germany, she would tell the story of Sergeant Washington and his men. When old prejudices surfaced in community discussions, she would describe the care with which Corporal Thompson had examined her children and the thoughtfulness with which Private Jackson had organized her pantry. Her testimony was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had initially shared those prejudices fully. She couldn't be dismissed as someone who had always been different or who had never understood the traditional way of thinking. She was a German woman, a mother, someone who had believed what most of her neighbors believed until experience taught her otherwise. The change in her own children was equally profound and lasting. Hans, who had learned English from the soldiers, would go on to study languages in university and eventually become a translator for international organizations. His facility with English opened doors that would have remained closed in a more isolated Germany, but more importantly, his early experience with people from different cultures gave him a comfort with diversity that would serve him throughout his life. Liesel, inspired by watching Corporal Thompson care for her family, would eventually become a nurse. Throughout her career, she would be known for her exceptional bedside manner and her ability to connect with patients from all backgrounds. She would often say that she had learned about the healing power of kindness by watching soldiers who could have been enemies choose instead to be helpers. Wilhelm, too young to remember the details of that week in March 1945, nevertheless grew up with an understanding that people were to be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. His parents' stories about the soldiers who had saved their family became part of the foundation of his moral education, teaching him values that would guide his decisions throughout his life. As the years passed and Germany struggled to come to terms with its role in the conflict and the ideologies that had led to such devastation, the story of Sergeant Washington and his men became something of a local legend in Remagen. Greta would tell it to her grandchildren, and they would tell it to their children, each generation learning the same lesson about the danger of prejudice and the power of personal experience to overcome even the most deeply ingrained misconceptions. The broader historical significance of such encounters has often been overlooked in accounts of the conflict's end, but they played a crucial role in the process of reconciliation and reconstruction that followed. When German civilians had positive personal experiences with Allied soldiers, particularly African-American soldiers, who had been the subjects of especially vicious propaganda, it helped to discredit not just specific lies about race, but the entire system of thinking that had made such lies believable. For Sergeant Washington and his men, the encounter with the Müller family was just one of many similar situations they faced throughout their service. They were part of a generation of African-American soldiers who fought not just for their country, but for the right to be seen as full Americans, worthy of the same respect and opportunities as their white compatriots. The irony that they had to travel to Germany to be treated with the dignity and respect that was often denied them at home was not lost on these men. Many would return to an America where racial segregation was still legal and where their military service, no matter how distinguished, would not protect them from discrimination and violence. But their service in Europe, and particularly their interactions with German civilians like the Müller family, had effects that reached far beyond the immediate circumstances. They demonstrated through their actions the falsehood of racial stereotypes, not just to German civilians, but to white American soldiers who served alongside them. They proved their competence, their courage, and their character in circumstances that left no room for doubt or rationalization. The broader impact of such proof would be felt in the years following the conflict, as America struggled with its own racial contradictions and gradually moved toward the civil rights movement that would transform American society. The service of African-American soldiers in the Second World War provided powerful ammunition for arguments about equality and justice that could not be easily dismissed or ignored. For Greta Müller, however, the historical significance was always secondary to the personal transformation she had experienced. She had learned that the categories she had been taught to believe in were not only false but actively harmful, creating barriers between people who shared far more than divided them. In 1955, 10 years after the encounter that had changed her life, Greta received an unexpected letter from the United States. It had been forwarded through several military offices and had taken months to reach her, but it was unmistakably from Sergeant Washington, now a civilian working as a teacher in Birmingham, Alabama. The letter was brief but warm, asking after her family's welfare and sharing news about his own life. He had married, he wrote, and had 2 children of his own. He had used his military benefits to attend college and had become an educator, working with children who, like Hans and Liesel and Wilhelm, deserved the chance to learn and grow regardless of the circumstances of their birth. He closed the letter with a sentiment that perfectly captured the lasting impact of their brief encounter. I often think about your family and hope that the kindness we were able to share during such a difficult time has continued to grow and spread. In my classroom, I try to teach my students the same lesson we all learned that week in Remagen, that people are much more alike than they are different, and that understanding this truth is the first step toward building a better world. Greta kept that letter for the rest of her life, reading it whenever she needed to be reminded of the power of human goodness to transcend even the most difficult circumstances. She would show it to her children as they grew older, and eventually to her grandchildren, as evidence that the story she told them was not just family legend but documented history. The letter also inspired her to write her own account of those days in March 1945, not for publication, but simply to ensure that the details would not be lost as memories faded with time. Her handwritten narrative, preserved in the family archives, provides a unique perspective on how individual encounters between people of different backgrounds could challenge and change deeply held prejudices. "I realize now," she wrote in one particularly reflective passage, "that I had never actually known any person whose skin was darker than mine. Everything I thought I knew was based on what other people had told me, people who probably had no more real experience than I did. When I finally met such people for myself, I discovered that everything I had been told was not just wrong, but absurdly, obviously wrong. They were not devils or savages or any of the terrible things I had been taught to expect. They were simply people, trying to do their jobs and help where they could, just like anyone else." This realization led to a broader questioning of other assumptions she had accepted without examination. If she had been so completely wrong about race, what other beliefs might be based on equally flimsy foundations? The process of reassessing her worldview was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was also liberating, freeing her from fears and prejudices that had limited her ability to connect with others. The impact on her children was equally profound, but manifested differently for each of them. Hans, whose fluency in English had made him something of a bridge between the soldiers and his family, developed a lifelong interest in communication across cultural boundaries. His work as a translator eventually led him to a position with the United Nations, where he helped facilitate discussions between representatives of countries that had once been enemies. Liesel's experience watching Corporal Thompson care for her family inspired her not just to become a nurse but to specialize in pediatric care. Throughout her career, she would be known for her exceptional ability to calm frightened children and help them trust medical personnel, who might initially seem scary or unfamiliar. Her colleagues often remarked on her unusual sensitivity to the fears that children might harbor about people who looked different from themselves. Wilhelm, whose memories of the events were more emotional than factual due to his age, grew up with an unusual openness to new experiences and unfamiliar people. As an adult, he would become a successful businessman with international connections, and his willingness to work with partners from different cultural backgrounds would be one of his greatest professional assets. But perhaps the most significant long-term impact was on Greta herself, who discovered that questioning one set of assumptions had opened her mind to questioning others. She became more involved in her community's post-conflict reconstruction efforts, often serving as a voice for moderation and reconciliation when others wanted to retreat into familiar prejudices and resentments. When African American soldiers were assigned to garrison duty in the area during the occupation period, she was among the few German civilians who welcomed their presence and worked to bridge the gap between the military personnel and the local population. Her first-hand experience with such soldiers gave her a credibility that others lacked, and her testimony helped to prevent some of the friction that occurred in other occupied territories. Years later, when asked by local historians to reflect on the most significant events of her life, she would always return to that week in March 1945, when her preconceptions had been so thoroughly demolished by reality. She described it as a kind of awakening, not just to the truth about race, but to the broader realization that most of what she thought she knew about the world was actually just what she had been told by others. The story of Greta Mueller and Sergeant James Washington represents thousands of similar encounters that occurred throughout Europe as the conflict drew to a close. Each individual story was unique in its details, but the pattern was remarkably consistent. When people met face to face, when they shared food and conversation and concern for each other's welfare, the artificial barriers that had seemed so important revealed themselves to be meaningless. These personal encounters were perhaps more important than any official denazification program or educational initiative in changing hearts and minds. They demonstrated through direct experience that propaganda was false, that racial theories were nonsense, and that human nature was far more generous and compassionate than wartime rhetoric had suggested. The legacy of such encounters extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. Children who witnessed their parents' assumptions, challenged and changed, grew up with a different understanding of human possibility. Communities that experienced positive interactions with formerly demonized groups developed new standards for evaluating truth claims about other peoples. In the broader context of post-conflict reconstruction, these personal transformations contributed to a fundamental shift in European attitudes toward race and prejudice. The moral authority of movements advocating racial equality was strengthened by countless individual testimonies from people who could speak from personal experience about the falsehood of racist ideology. For African American soldiers, these encounters provided evidence that their military service was having an impact beyond the immediate objectives of their missions. They were not just fighting for military victory, but also demonstrating through their conduct the injustice of the discrimination they faced at home. Every act of kindness toward former enemies strengthened the argument that they deserved equal treatment as American citizens. The transformation in Greta Mueller's understanding was particularly significant because it was so complete and so public. She didn't simply abandon her previous prejudices quietly. She became an active advocate for a different way of seeing the world. Her story became a powerful tool for challenging similar prejudices in others, precisely because it came from someone who had once shared those prejudices fully. In 1963, 18 years after her encounter with Sergeant Washington and his men, Greta received an invitation that would bring the story full circle. The city of Birmingham, Alabama, was hosting a conference on racial reconciliation, and organizers had learned of her story through correspondence with James Washington, who was now a respected educator and civil rights advocate in his hometown. They invited her to speak about her experience as an example of how personal encounters could overcome even deeply ingrained prejudice. The invitation came at a time when Birmingham was at the center of the American civil rights movement, and her testimony about the character of African American soldiers was seen as particularly valuable. Greta was initially reluctant to accept, feeling that her English was not adequate for such an important occasion and that her experience was not significant enough to warrant international attention. But Hans, now working for the United Nations and thoroughly familiar with the ongoing struggle for racial equality in America, convinced her that her story could make a real difference. The trip to Birmingham in the summer of 1963 was Greta's first visit to America and her first reunion with James Washington since he had marched away from Remagen 18 years earlier. The meeting was emotional for both of them, but it was also an opportunity to reflect on how much the world had changed since their first encounter. James Washington had indeed become a respected educator, but his path had not been easy. Despite his distinguished military service, he had returned to an Alabama where racial segregation was strictly enforced and where his status as a veteran provided little protection from discrimination. He had used his military benefits to attend college, but had been required to attend a segregated institution. He had become a teacher, but had been assigned to an underfunded school for African American children. Nevertheless, he had persevered, becoming a leader in efforts to improve educational opportunities for all children, regardless of race. His experience with German civilians during the conflict had reinforced his belief that prejudice was learned rather than natural, and therefore could be unlearned through education and positive experiences. The conference in Birmingham brought together people from around the world who had similar stories of transformation and reconciliation. Greta's presentation, delivered in careful but heartfelt English, was one of the most powerful testimonies of the entire event. She spoke about the fear and prejudice she had felt when the soldiers first arrived in Remagen, and the complete reversal of those feelings as she witnessed their kindness and humanity. She described the impact on her children, who had learned lessons about equality and human worth that no textbook could have provided. She talked about the changes in her own community as similar stories spread, and people began to question other assumptions they had accepted without examination. Most importantly, she spoke directly to the African American audience members about the courage and dignity that soldiers like James Washington had demonstrated, not just in combat, but in their daily interactions with people who had been taught to hate them. She credited those soldiers with saving not just her family's lives, but her family's souls, by showing them the path away from hatred and fear. The response to her presentation was overwhelming. Many audience members approached her afterward to share their own stories of transformation. or to thank her for providing evidence that change was possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. Her story was covered by newspapers throughout the United States, and excerpts from her speech were reprinted in civil rights publications, as an example of how personal experiences could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. For James Washington, seeing his former charge become an advocate for racial equality was perhaps the most satisfying validation of his military service. He had always believed that the kindness he and his men had shown to German civilians was not just the right thing to do, but also a strategic investment in a better future. Greta's presence in Birmingham demonstrated that such investments could indeed pay dividends across decades and continents. The reunion also provided an opportunity for both of them to reflect on the broader historical significance of their encounter. They had lived through a period of unprecedented global conflict, but they had also witnessed the power of individual human connections to transcend even the most bitter divisions. Their story was not unique. Thousands of similar encounters had occurred throughout Europe as the conflict ended, but it was representative of the possibility for reconciliation and understanding that existed even in the darkest of times. It demonstrated that prejudice, no matter how deeply ingrained, could be overcome through direct experience and human contact. In the years following the Birmingham Conference, Greta remained active in efforts to promote understanding between different groups. She corresponded with educators and civil rights activists throughout Europe and America, sharing her story and encouraging others to look beyond surface differences to recognize common humanity. Her children and grandchildren continued to be influenced by the lessons she had learned during that transformative week in 1945. They grew up with a different understanding of human possibility, one that emphasized the importance of judging people by their actions rather than their appearance or background. The broader impact of stories like Greta's extended far beyond the individuals directly involved. They became part of the foundation for post-conflict reconstruction efforts that emphasized reconciliation and understanding rather than revenge and continued division. They provided evidence that even the most bitter enemies could find common ground when they met as human beings rather than as representatives of opposing ideologies. As she aged, Greta often reflected on the irony that some of the most important lessons of her life had come from people she had been taught to fear and hate. The soldiers who had knocked on her door that March morning in 1945 had brought more than food and medical supplies. They had brought the possibility of a different way of seeing the world. The transformation she underwent during those few days was not just personal but generational. Her children grew up with values that their grandparents might have found incomprehensible, and they passed those values on to their own children. The prejudices that had once seemed natural and inevitable gradually gave way to a more generous understanding of human nature and possibility. When Greta Mueller died in 1987, at the age of 84, her funeral was attended by people from many different backgrounds, including several African-American military personnel who had learned of her story and wanted to pay their respects. Her obituary in the local newspaper focused not on the hardships she had endured during the conflict, but on the lessons she had learned and shared about the power of human kindness to overcome division and hatred. James Washington, who had maintained correspondence with the Mueller family throughout his life, was among those who sent condolences. His letter to Hans, now a grandfather himself, reflected on the lasting impact of that brief encounter so many years earlier. "Your mother," he wrote, "was one of the most courageous people I ever met. It takes courage to face enemy soldiers at your door, but it takes even more courage to question everything you've been taught to believe and to change your mind when you discover you were wrong." She did both, and in doing so, she not only saved herself from the poison of prejudice, but also helped to heal a wounded world. The story of Greta Mueller and Sergeant James Washington reminds us that even in the darkest periods of history, individual acts of kindness and understanding can create ripple effects that extend far beyond their immediate circumstances. Their encounter in Remagen was brief, lasting only a few days, but its impact continued to spread across generations and continents. It demonstrates that prejudice, no matter how deeply rooted or widely accepted, is ultimately vulnerable to the simple truth of human experience. When people meet face to face, when they share food and conversation, and concern for each other's welfare, the artificial barriers that seemed so important reveal themselves to be meaningless constructions that cannot withstand the reality of human connection. Their story also illustrates the profound responsibility that comes with the power to influence others' perceptions. The African-American soldiers who served in Europe during the final stages of the conflict were not just fighting for military objectives. They were also serving as ambassadors for their race and their nation. Their conduct in countless small encounters like this one helped to shape attitudes and beliefs that would influence the course of history for decades to come. For contemporary readers, the story offers both inspiration and instruction. It reminds us that transformation is possible, that even the most entrenched prejudices can be overcome through personal experience and human contact. It challenges us to examine our own assumptions and to remain open to evidence that contradicts what we think we know about others. Most importantly, it demonstrates the power of individual choice in shaping the kind of world we live in. Sergeant Washington and his men chose kindness over indifference, understanding over judgment, and hope over despair. Greta Muller chose openness over closed-mindedness, growth over stagnation, and truth over comfortable lies. Their choices, made in a small German town during a few days in March 1945, helped to create the possibility for reconciliation and understanding that continues to influence our world today. They remind us that each of us has the power to choose how we respond to those who are different from ourselves, and that those choices, however small they may seem, can have consequences that extend far beyond what we can imagine. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.